there are over 10,100 Palestinians in Zionist prisons.
But nobody really talks about the British Mandate periods. You see Britain's grubby fingerprints all over the globe when it comes to the history of the prison system.
Palestinians are stripped naked and made to wear these white bodysuits. It reminds me of the bodysuit of Guantanamo.
They claim to want peace, but why do you have CIA black sites across the world torturing people?
If it was possible for there to be more torture taking place anywhere outside of Guantanamo Bay or Zionist prisons, then that trophy goes to the Syrian prisons. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Shagufta and welcome to another Talking Point podcast. Today we are going to be talking about prisons. In particular, we're going to look at the Zionist prisons that have been used to lock up the Palestinians. We're also going to be looking at prisons elsewhere in the world. We're going to be asking, where has the idea of prisons come from and why have they been used in so much of the world? We're going to be looking in particular at the Muslim world and also Islam's view on prisons. And we're going to be asking ourselves, is there any justice in the prison system? Can there be any justice in the prison system? So I think whether you are a reformist or an abolitionist, there is something in today's episode for everybody. I'd like to introduce my two guests today. They are Farhana and Zakia. Assalamu alaikum to you both.
Wa alaikum salam, Shagufta.
Alaikum salam, rahmatullah.
Okay, so I want to start by talking about Dr. Adnan. Now, this is somebody whose name we've all probably heard in the last few weeks. He was probably the best orthopedic surgeon in Gaza. He had received his training at King's College here in London, and he disappeared from Gaza last year in December 2023. And he was taken to Sidi Tayman prison, where eyewitnesses have said that he turned up showing signs of abuse. And this is a prison where there are well-reported cases of physical, mental, and sexual abuse. But he turned up at the gates already with broken ribs and breathing difficulties and obvious signs of having been tortured. This is from eyewitnesses. Then he turned up in Ophir prison in Al-Quds in April 2024. And again, from eyewitness statements, we've heard that he was brought into the prison yard and he was left in the middle of the yard with obvious injuries. He was naked in the lower part of his body. And when the prisoners went to help him, they brought him into one of the rooms, and almost immediately the screams came out and he was martyred. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept him as one of the shaheed. Now, this is a story that has been spread all over social media in the last few weeks, and it just brought home the situation of the prisons in the Zionist entity. And the Palestinian Prisoners Club, they've actually said that there are over 10,100 Palestinians in prison, in Zionist prisons, and that 3,398 of these are held in administrative detention. And we know that from Gaza, the resistance fighters will often take hostages, especially of the IDF, to negotiate prisoner release. This is the extent to which it has become a part of the Zionist occupation. And whenever prisoners are released, they always speak of torture. So I'd like to start by asking the question, why have prisons and the taking of prisoners by the Zionist state, why has this been such a central part of the occupation, the colonization, and the now genocide taking place in Palestine?
Jazakallah khair, Shagufta. Okay, so I think it's important to start with the fact that the prison system under the Zionist state is actually not a creation of theirs. it's not something that started with them. It didn't just fall out of the sky. There has to be a context in which we discuss the Zionist prison system. And that is the fact that what preceded the Zionist state was actually another occupation, which was the British Mandate, right? That existed between 1917 up and until 1948. And it's really interesting when you look at the tactics that the British used within Palestine, and you'll start seeing the links. And the reason I went into that is because my husband's father's side was actually made refugees after they had to leave Haifa in 1948. And they ended up in Tulkarem in a refugee camp called Nur Shams. And when we looked up Nur Shams, it used to be an old detention facility. So within that camp, you know, like the buildings and stuff, they've still got the bars on the windows that have now become homes, basically homes and schools and, you know, healthcare centers and whatnot. So when I started looking into what did Palestine look like under the British Mandate, obviously you get a totally different picture to what we all know now, which is, this is a 76-year-old occupation, started in 1948. You know, people want to talk about even 1967 borders, you know, forget 76 years. It's such an insult, really, to what the Palestinians have had to endure for so many generations. And, you know, you realize there's an amnesia or this that's like taking place, or there's a monopoly on the history of Palestine, where there is a real push to kind of whitewash over these crimes that have taken place in this land. So, parts of the things that I researched is obviously beyond the scope of, prisons. Yeah. So just to give an idea, like the way that the Zionist regime are using things like, aerial bombing, Palestinians as human shields, military night raids, all these kind of things that we're seeing. These are also part and parcel of British military tactics that took place under the Mandate. But specifically to do with when it comes to now the prison system, this has historically always been a colonial tool for use of labor and to control the population through this type of like incarceration, through the fear of being incarcerated, to punish anyone that opposes the colonizing regime, to punish anyone that resists occupation. And this is whether they've done it peacefully or through legally armed resistance. And it's important to say legally armed resistance as well, because the first 20 years under the British Mandate, you could say that it was pretty peaceful, the resistance. And it was only until the Great Arab Revolt in mid-1930s is when actually there was an armed resistance. And this is basically when the British military took, the prison system to another level. So what we found was that large parts of Palestine actually were turned into prison camps. And because these rebels, who were just like workers, like urban workers, yeah, because it was controlled militarily, the sentencing was really quick, and actually they were given quite long sentences as well. And this is sort of the start of what we've come to know now as administrative detention. Yeah. Like they were held without trial. There was overcrowding, bad hygiene. So you can see the similarities of the Zionist prisons and what preceded that. 1939, it was reported that there were around 13 detention camps. Several of them were described by the British themselves as concentration camps. Yeah. And it started off housing around 4,800 men. And that number quickly rose to 9,000 within that year. And so, one of those camps was the Nur Shams camp, which ended up being turned into a refugee camp, basically, after the British left. And even to this day, 6 of these prison detention centers still exist today, and they're used today as we speak. I mean, there was so much information on this, but there was this interesting person called Charles Teggett, and he was brought in specifically as somebody who used to be in charge of the police force in colonial India. And so he was brought into the West Bank, And he basically built these, they were called Arab investigation centers. And they were basically known as torture chambers. And he basically set up these these facilities in Jerusalem to train how to be an interrogator in torturing Arabs at that time. And he was also known to like build up these police fortresses. Like you could say like synonymous with, you know, these IDF lookouts that you get now that you see on the sides of roads or between the enclaves within the West Bank. So similar type of structure to that.
I didn't know that. So what for them worked in India, they brought it to try and make it work for them also in the Middle East.
Yeah. I like, you could say like it's exactly the same thing. I mean, your question was about Zionist prisons. I haven't even talked about Zionist prisons because when you talk about the British prisons that existed, I mean, there's no difference, right? So we're talking about an inherited colonial occupation. I think that's the way that we need to describe it. And this, you know, this still exists today.
That's a really, you know, what you were saying about how people like to start the conversation when it comes to Palestine, you know, as far back as 1948, but nobody really talks about the British Mandate periods. Yeah. And you're absolutely right, because it's you know, when you're saying that a lot of the prison structures and the infrastructure, like the physical buildings, still remain today. And I remember you telling us once that your was it your father-in-law's father was in prison in one of those same British built prisons in Palestine, subhanAllah. Yeah. And it was funny because when I was looking up into the history of prisons, like how old are they, where did they come from, that sort of thing. And you can see this same history is shared across so many regions of the world where British colonialism kind of spread. Like I was going through Africa, for example, in Kenya and Uganda and Nigeria, when the British colonized these countries, they did the same thing there as they did in Palestine and what you're saying in India as well, where prisons didn't exist in Kenya before the British came. And by the time they left, there were over 100, you know, incarceration sites or detention sites, prisons, that sort of thing. Same thing in India, Pakistan, you know, Canada, the USA, Australia, all of these places, all of the origins of the prisons, if you follow them back, you can trace them back to British colonialism. And, you know, like you were saying, they brought Charles Teggett, who then, you know, trained them up basically in how to oppress this population, the native population. You can see they've done really similar things all over the world.
You know, I think you know when you read about it and you see the way that you know, wording has changed. Yeah. So, you know, you went from British Mandate, which is just a fancy word for British occupation, right? And then you've got the Israeli state, which is another fancy word for a settler colonial entity, right? And then you've got, you know, the British military, which was then replaced by the IDF. Who are the IDF? The IDF are basically a combination of the gangs, the militia gangs that existed at the time. And they've basically now come under a official, you know, military organization. Yeah, I mean, you can dress it up all you want. You can call it a democracy. You can call it the moral army. You can call it whatever you want. However, you know, when you start tracing things back, then you can see this is where you're going to get to the root of where the actual issue is, which is that this is a colonial occupation. And what is happening now is a protection of that colonial occupation in, you know, with whatever means.
Yeah, it's just making me think. I mean, you mentioned the IDF, and we've seen in all of the pictures and videos that come out of Palestine, the Palestinians' interaction is always with the soldiers, with the IDF, you know, in their full military gear, armed, and in that specific IDF uniform. We know that there is a police force separate in the Zionist state as well. But when it comes to who deals with the Palestinians, when the Zionist entity feels there's something that they need to be pulled up about, it's the military that's sent in. So it's the military, it's the IDF that goes into the homes, that is patrolling the streets, that is manning the checkpoints. Even Masjid al-Aqsa is policed, so to speak, by the IDF, by the military. Traffic stops. It's like we might see two policemen walking down the street here in the UK, and there the Palestinians will see two armed soldiers walking down the street. So it's like a completely different setup to what we might compare to, like, two policemen on the beat or Bobby on the beat to, make people feel safe. Whereas there, you'll have two soldiers, armed soldiers, walking down the street to actually make people feel afraid. And the comparison is quite deliberate.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a military state. This is not any kind of normal nation or, that we've seen. The only one that you can compare to is Kashmir, who also lives under a military occupation as well. But it basically just means that you've got boots on the ground, right? And on top of boots on the ground, you've got, like when you go onto the IDF website, you actually see like a whole list of like different roles that exist within the IDF. So within that, you can see there is a police force. You can see that there's like medics, there's loads basically. So because of the fact that generally, apart from a few exemptions within their society, they have to serve mandatory, I think it's 3 years when they're about, I think, 18. You could, the whole society is considered to be like military personnel to some degree or not, whether they are active or not active. Yeah. So that makes a big difference in the way that a society functions. Yeah. And the way that you see the occupation. So yeah, it's nothing. There's nothing normal about the way that land is run. There also is a need to have a justification for a military so that the occupation can continue, right? So, for example, this is why you hear, well, we used to hear a lot, right, about the Palestinians are just inherently, they're violent, they are uncivilized, they want to commit this apparent genocide against the Jewish people. It's trying to pull every racist, fascist, trying to smear people with anti-Semitism, anything that they can think of. Because actually, when you look at the crimes that are actually being committed in Palestine, what is it? What is it that they are getting arrested for, or that they're getting charged for? We're talking about Palestinians who are attending protests, peaceful protests, yeah? Palestinians who are involved in political activism. Palestinians or children, really, that are throwing stones. Yeah, they're throwing stones at tanks. They're throwing stones at soldiers who are fully kitted up, armed. I even heard of children that are getting arrested for picking herbs a little bit too close to an illegal settler colony. Yeah, I mean, these are the kind of things that we're talking about.
We talked about this in one of our earlier Palestine podcasts, but like how necessary it is to dehumanize the enemy or the population, the natives that you're trying to occupy and kill and, ethnically cleanse from the land, because that's how you can justify the sort of barbarity that you're inflicting upon these people. That's how you justify locking up a 12-year-old child. And again, just, it made me think again of the sorts of crimes that the British would lock up the natives for. So, for example, things like they would, they come in, they colonize the land and they impose taxes on the people when, they never existed before, and say, oh, you're going to jail because you're not paying the occupiers money from your hard-earned cash, or, you're resisting this occupation. And so we're going to lock you up. Any sort of political opponents were thrown in jail as well, say in British colonial Kenya. And it sounds so similar. It's crazy, the echoing through history of, what was happening back then to now, of any signs of opposition to the occupation, to the Zionist occupation, sends you ticket straight to jail.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that is quite unique about what's happening in the Zionist entity again, we have to take it back to the British mandate because they're the ones that came up with it. And then later on, you could say like the US sort of perfected it, I guess, is this concept of administrative detention, which is basically where you can be held without trial, without any formal charges. And then you have this thing called like secret evidence, which you, as the person who've been arrested, you won't know, you don't know what it is, basically. Your lawyers don't know what it is. And they basically can just hold you on this secret evidence for an unspecified amount of time, right? So, I mean, they will sort of hold you for 6 months, then you'll go to this court, then the judge may view this, whatever, this secret evidence, and then you could be sent back to prison for another 6 months. Yeah, I mean, we've heard of people that have been under administrative detention for 10 years. The other day, I saw a brother who was in detention for, I think it was 40 plus years. And like many of my husband's family as well, just again, unspecified amount of time. And I've said to you as well, the crimes that we're talking about is literally like attending something, listening to something, sharing something, throwing a stone. Yeah. This is the threat that we are talking about. This is the justification that has allowed this entity to basically shoot, detain, and what we are seeing now, right? Which is complete massacring of people. And what you find is like within every family, minimum you'll get at least one male, yeah, that has served time or another. And a lot of the time as well, they may use say they look, they're after somebody, they'll go into that town and then they will take one of the children from that family, because there's a lot of surveillance that goes on in the West Bank as well, right? And they'll use that child as a bargaining chip.
One of my friends was saying that, subhanAllah, she spent some time in Palestine, and she was saying that the mothers there, they expect half of their children to die or be arrested or to go, because that's just how common it is. So if they have, 6 children, they expect 3 of them to not survive.
Certainly, it does. I mean, from everything we have seen of the reality and what you are sharing with us now, we can see that prisons and the prison system in the Zionist entity is used to oppress the indigenous people. And definitely it's well documented, the torture and the treatment, the ill treatment that prisoners go through. But both of you have touched just now on the families and the mothers of those who are taken. And, I think this is another aspect that we, maybe we can go on to this now about how, yes, there's obviously the life of the prisoner and how that is affected, but there's also the aspect of the impact that it has on the families left behind. And I've heard stories of how women, Palestinian women under the British occupation, so, going back to the British mandate that you talked about, Zakia, how when their menfolk were taken and locked up in these British prisons, the women would sing in code to their menfolk locked up in the prison. So they'd go to the prisons and they'd press themselves up against the prison wall and sing to their loved ones inside, but in code. So in a way where the British could not understand what they were saying. And the way they would do this is they would add an extra syllable followed by a vowel, and this would be between words. They'd sing to them stories of love, or they'd actually maybe even pass on information and messages about a possible rescue attempt that was coming. And also, I've heard stories of how Palestinian women, and this is especially for those whose husbands are serving very, very long sentences, they've been able to smuggle out sperm to have IVF treatment and to have children. IVF doctors in the West Bank have spoken about how Palestinian women will come, with small bottles or plastic cups, and how they ask them to bring with them two family members from each of their families, one from the husband's family and one from the wife's family, to to testify that this is genuine. And then they say to the women, before they even carry out the IVF, go back to your village, go back to your town, go back to your family and friends, and tell people, spread the news that you're about to have this IVF treatment carried out, because people think your husband is in prison. So, this is how they protect their honor and their family's honor. But these are the lengths that families go to overcome what actually, this prison system that actually impacts all of them. Can you tell us some more about the impact that this has on families, and why this is actually a part of the design, how this is actually deliberate?
Look, I think, without a doubt, every arrest has a traumatic effect on each and every family member, whether it's the parents, the spouses, the children to be. But I think there is something that is quite wild about what's happened in the last sort of 10, 20 years, is the lowering of the age of arrest. Yeah. And that's had a really detrimental effect. Even just emotionally, when you read about it, because they're actually saying that children as young as 12 now can be arrested. And this is a new, from as far as I know, this is something new that they've passed. Yeah, my son is 12. My son is who's busy with his, playing games and football and whatnot and doing homework. He can be somebody who would be considered arrestable age, basically, for doing the wrong thing, for saying the wrong thing, for just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yeah. So they found that at the end of June 2024, the Israeli prison service, they were holding about 226 Palestinian minors. And this is something that came to light, obviously, in the last year. SubhanAllah, so many things have come to light in the past year. But it was basically when the hostage exchange took place in 2023 in November. There was an article in the Time magazine, and they were basically asking, why are there so many children being held in Israeli prisons? Because from the 240 that were released, they were all women and children, right? And that's because every year you're looking at between 500, 700 children that are incarcerated and prosecuted every single year. So what do you expect?
And you were saying that there are 226 Palestinian minors, and that's minors by their definition of being under 12. Yeah. Forget the international, definition of under 18. That's probably far greater. So it's just, man, these are kids from year 7, year 8 who most of them haven't even hit puberty yet. They're still those little teeny tiny children, literally children.
And some of them are children that go on to become men in the prisons, without their families and not having access, to their families. So, when I think about these children now, I remember watching a documentary actually a long time ago about the effects of incarceration on children, as well as other things, like in Gaza, especially when children are targeted as well on the street. But they're trying to break that family, and subhanAllah, it is by Allah's mercy that these men, these women, these children are, especially the young, who are able to continue to make a life for themselves. They come out, they get married, they have children, they do continue with life. Even though I'm sure there are so many that are suffering from mental health, as a result of the treatment that they faced, within these prisons. But definitely you can see that, this, it leads to the fracturing, obviously, of these families, which then in turn leads to the fracturing of the society. So, of course, this is by design. I mean, we're talking about one aspect here, just the prison service, how that is just one fracture of breaking or attempting to break the Palestinian society, and that wasn't enough. that wasn't enough, because you can see what's happening now. There is a case that I wanted to talk about. This brother called Muazzaz Abate, and he was a bodybuilder. So he's not from Gaza, he's actually from the West Bank. And, if you look at his previous photos, he's like a tall guy, big guy. He's a bodybuilder, he's a father, he's got a few daughters. And they arrested him. Again, no charge, nothing. And when they released him after 9 months, you would not be able to know that these are the same people. He came out emaciated. Yeah, and his hand was broken and he was limping, and they had him on the hospital bed, and he was, as he was talking, like he was saying that I have the prison inside me. I have the prison inside me. And I then heard just recently that he has been rearrested. What more can they do to him except basically to just finish him off now?
I saw the pictures before and after, and he was unrecognizable. You could not tell it was the same person.
No, not at all. You could see it in his eyes. And the thing is that you've got these human rights organizations, like B'Tselem, Al-Haq, Human Rights Watch, Ademir, you've got Amnesty International. That's 5 that I've mentioned. They've documented all of it, right? And they, every now and again, they will, present these things to the Geneva Convention and to the UN. So the infuriating part in all of this is that, they want to talk about that they are a violation of international law and whatnot. But actually, as we're discussing, when you start looking at the broader picture, you can see that we're talking about all these previous colonial structures that still exist today. Right. And they exist because they want to protect itself. That is why all of these inhumane, practices are still going on, and why no one's doing anything about it, regardless of even if you have 100 human rights organizations all blasting the same thing. And the other thing is that, I just heard, obviously Trump is now, he's coming into the new administration in January, and one of his lackeys, Lindsey Graham, I did see a statement that he made, and he was basically saying that this was soon after the whole ICC arrest warrants that came out after Netanyahu, and he was saying that the laws are not there to go after us. I'm paraphrasing here, by the way, but imagine that's what he said, that the laws were not made to go after us. And who is he talking about? He said talking about Israel. He's talking about the US, European powers. We need to be thinking more, outwardly, which is you can discuss the reality as much as you want, and it's horrifying. But, it can potentially paralyze you if we don't start talking about the broader picture and about how, as a community, we need to start discussing these issues.
I think you're absolutely right in that we need to start making the links. We need to keep zooming out and saying, okay, who stands to gain and benefit from this whole project, from this whole exercise, right? This affront to human rights and human decency and morality, etc., that, the whole world is outraged. Who is gaining from it? Who's standing behind it? Who's actively supporting it, right? And then what do they have to gain from it? And where have they done this before, right? And like we're saying that, just prisons is one example of it. You see Britain's grubby fingerprints all over the globe when it comes to the history of the prison system. I'm gonna jump back just for a second. Shkufta, when you mentioned about the impact on families and how destroying this is to that really essential family structure. That's the basis of all societies and communities, isn't it? It starts with that family, and then you've got families that come together. And linking it again with colonialism and just seeing how has this been used in the past to break up societies and families by attacking children, by attacking that family structure. When I was looking into, for example, in Australia, you had the story about the stolen generations, which was Australian policy by lawmakers over, spanning about 100 years, where the government was stealing Aboriginal and Native children from their families and incarcerating them. right? It was under the assimilation policy, which proposed that Aboriginal people should be allowed to die out through a process of natural elimination, or where possible, assimilated into the white community by training them to be laborers and domestics. But what this actually meant was that thousands of children were being taken by the police from their homes on their way to schools and incarcerated, flogged, starved, tied up, beaten to death, denied any sort of link to their families, denied their culture, punished if they did. And they found mass graves, underneath these schools, as they called them. And this was only by using like underground radars.
Yeah. So in this, I mean, you can see in this way, what you've done is you've just, there's no continuation of these people now, because if you take away the children and you take away the menfolk and you don't allow them to grow the next generation, generation never grows. You just have an aging population who might be, some of them might be free, but then they die out.
It will eventually, die out. Exactly. In the USA, you had an estimated native population of 10 million people living on the continent when the settlers arrived. And by the 1900s, the estimated indigenous population was less than 300,000. That's from 10 million to 300,000. And in the USA, you had a similar Indian boarding school system they had. And this was a 200-year-long policy of forced, and again, in inverted commas, assimilation, where tens of thousands of indigenous children were forcibly abducted from their families, sent to faraway boarding schools where they were given English names, cut their hair, forbidden from speaking their native language, beaten, starved, abused. And, they found over 900 of these children buried beneath the schools. And this is an underestimate, because if you think of a 200-year-long policy and a population that's shrunk from 10 million to, less than 300,000, there's going to be way more than 900 children who've died. You had the same thing happening in Canada under the Department of the Indian Affairs. Same issue, same aim of assimilation of the native populations into Euro-Canadian society. And this was over a period of 120 years. They found over 4,000 students who died. In October 2022, and this is significant, the House of Commons of Canada unanimously passed a motion calling on the federal government to recognize the residential school system as genocide, right? When we talk about tools of the colonizers, tools and ways that colonialism works, how do they go to a country, go to a nation, ethnically cleanse, wipe out, genocide them? It's not just the bombs. They do it through multiple different ways.
I was going to say, after the fact. It's all well and good calling it a genocide after the fact.
Yeah, that really makes, oh, I'm so sorry. What are you going to,
But we will give you that grace by calling it a genocide. There you go.
And definitely the way in which they have done this to children, to the next generation, to end a bloodline. Just to end a bloodline, to cull it, to just put a halt to this, this problem of the native population. I mean, definitely in Palestine, there is, I started off actually at the beginning talking about Dr. Adnan, but there's a child prisoner who, for me, has, become to signify so much. And that is, Ahmed Manasara. And I call him a child prisoner, but he's no longer a child. That's how long he's been held. But he was taken as a child. And, his case has become to signify so much about what is wrong with this Zionist prison system.
The case of Ahmed Manasra, subhanAllah, he is obviously, we're talking about one case out of thousands. And, this is why, I guess, just on a side note, from what Zakia was saying, these are like continuations of what happened in Canada. It's the continuation of what happened in Australia. It's continuation of what happened in America. These are like it's like they have inherited subhanAllah, they've inherited this occupation and what is done to them. But, with Ahmed bin Nasr in particular, I don't know what it is about this case, but I agree with you. It does something. It brings tears to your eyes, honestly, every time you read about his case, because he was just 13 when he was arrested. And he was arrested because he went to go and try to help his cousin, who was actually, I think he was involved in like stone throwing. And so he was arrested by accident, and his cousin was shot, and they took him in. There is a video evidence of him being interrogated and how they managed to get a false confession from him. And the reason he did it is because they tortured him, basically. And like in the video, you can see he's like hitting his head, and he just looks so distressed. And he is now 21 years old. So he's been in incarceration for 8 years, and he's still wearing the same coat. So the coat that he was wearing at the age of 13, he's still wearing that coat now at the age of 21. He's kind of grown into it. And he's suffered psychologically. He has he's basically been destroyed. You can see it on his face, and you can even see the way that it's affected his family, especially his mother. There was a documentary on Al Jazeera about his family, and his mother was, smelling his clothes in their home, and his clothes are like as he was as a teenage boy, and she's smelling his clothes, and she's looking at his picture, and that's her baby, basically, her little boy. The thing is that I think, again, like you have to look at, I know we're talking about prisons, but, the whole occupation, you could see it as an imprisonment, right? If you're looking at the West Bank, the way that it's been cut up into all these designated, areas A, areas B, areas C, the enclaves that have been created, the illegal settlements that have been scattered throughout the West Bank, even the way that within the Palestinian areas where they've got a police force that are from the Palestinian people themselves, who essentially serve as a defense for the Zionist entity. The fact that Gaza is even described as an open air prison, right? And now more recently has been described as a concentration camp. So where you have a Zionist occupation that considers like pretty much the whole population to be terrorists, right? Including disabled children, including babies who've been left to rot in incubators. It goes outside of, you have to start looking at it from outside of just the physical prison that we see, because of the fact that there are now so many countless examples that we are seeing daily of this level of inhumane behavior that is not just taking place within the prisons, but actually taking place outside of these prisons as well.
It's colonialism and its occupation and its destruction of these people's lives, of the Palestinians' lives, in so many different ways. It's the physical imprisonment of people, like you were saying. It's the complete restriction on their normal day-to-day living. It's the fact that you can have, Israeli Zionist settlers who are just allowed to encroach and decide, I want this piece of land, and, just bulldoze existing homes. This idea of settler colonialism, which, again, like you've got, it's not a new idea. It's not a new tactic, settler colonialism, this idea of you can just the colonizers can bring their people, dump them on a place, and then just, lay claim to the land and push out the natives, by any means. And it just made me think about, I was thinking about what we talked about in the beginning of our Power Sign podcast, of how we know when the Zionist entity, that project was first, written up in the Middle East. It was the idea that the Europeans had this Jewish problem, right? They didn't like the Jews in Europe, these undesirables, and they didn't know where to put them. And so Herzl went and approached, the Ottoman, and then he went to approach the British of where can we set up the Zionist homeland. And there were different, places that were proposed, and eventually they settled on Palestine, which was in the heart of the Arab world, and served various purposes, right? So the British then agreed to support them in that endeavor and took the undesirables of Europe, the Jewish population, and dumped them in the middle or the heart of the Middle East because it served their interests. And it just made me think for a second about it was eerily similar to how almost Australia was set up. And I'll justify what I'm saying in a second. So Britain back in the 18th century, when it was just kind of like emerging, colonialism was big, the empire was growing. They had, to expand your empire, you need people on the ground, right? And they, in 1717, had a Transportation Act where they would basically clean up the streets of Britain. They'd clean up all the undesirables, the poor, the people in debt, the ones with unsavory occupations, anyone they didn't really, not the nice people that they like, the undesirables, swept them all up and would either imprison them or, after the Transportation Act, put them on a ship and cart them off to initially America, but then the Americas kind of resisted and revolted, so then they couldn't send them there anymore. So they sent them off to the penal colony in Australia. Now, Australia was an uninhabited place with, really unsavory living conditions. It wasn't set up yet for a society. They tried in the past, they'd failed, but now they were going to make a real go of it. So the British took their undesirables to see if they could survive there. The prisoners or convicts, for whatever charge, and oftentimes it was really minor charges, would do the dirty work of exterminating the natives, setting up the foundations, building, the new world, basically, and extracting the natural resources. And then eventually those prisoners or convicts who did well were rewarded and given land and became wealthy in that place, right? So then the colony of Australia expanded, and eventually Britain were like, okay, great, this is now livable, let's move in. So they took their, undesirables from Britain, dumped them in Australia, let them colonize, destroy the Aboriginal natives, and set up shop, which felt very, very similar to the way that they took the undesirables of Europe, dumped them in the middle of the Arab lands, let them do the dirty work, and, and then they move in. And it really, what we were talking about earlier, you've got to zoom out and see who is funding this, who's supporting this, who stands to gain. We've seen on the news countless times of how many billions the US are investing, how the UK has invested as well, but also been complicit in terms of intelligence and, supporting the Zionist army in that way as well. Why would they do this? If they didn't still have a vested interest, why would they, risk losing their moral standing on the world stage? The US now has not a single moral foot to stand on in any international space because they're thinking you're a joke. You're sitting there allowing a genocide to happen and you're preaching to us about morals and goodness, etc., etc. Why would they risk losing that? Well, because they've got something greater to gain. There is a reason they are supporting and funding this genocide.
That's right. I think you made a really important point a couple of times now that it is really important for us to zoom out. And I think when we zoom out, we also should examine where else this is happening, because definitely for me, the pictures that are coming out of Palestine, of prisoner treatment by the Zionist entity in Zionist prisons, by the testimonies and statements that are coming out, all of this, it reminds me of pictures that came out during the invasion of Iraq, during the West's war on terror, when it was American soldiers actually who were torturing Iraqi prisoners. And the white bodysuits that we see now prisoners wearing in Gaza as they are rounded up by the IDF, those white bodysuits, the fact that people are stripped naked and then made to wear these white bodysuits, it reminds me of the orange bodysuits of Guantanamo Bay. So, there's similarities here. And, maybe this is something we can talk about, how prisons have also been used in the invasion of Iraq, in the war on terror, and just have a look a little bit at some of the commonalities.
Yeah, I think that that is a really good point, because when you're looking at zooming out, the Zionist occupation is linked to Britain, obviously. And the Zionist occupation is also linked to the US, who is the superpower now, right? Since World War II. And interestingly, there was a statement that was brought up by an Israeli official who basically said that, why should America get to use Guantanamo Bay and use administrative detention and use this style of justice, and why should the Israelis not be able to do the same? That why should we not be able to take advantage of the same,
Wow.
Yeah. It was, it's not funny, obviously, but it is quite shocking. SubhanAllah, if you look at the way that even now infamous Guantanamo Bay was set up, we're talking about, post 9/11, the US had to find a way basically to increase surveillance, increase spying, increase its ability to, arrest and, change parts of its criminal justice system because of like the new bogeyman, which was Islam, basically. And they brought out this new policy called the Patriot Act, right, to allow all of these things. Okay. And then so what happened was exactly that, which is increased arrests, increased incarceration of anyone that was suspected, and I say that in quotes, or links or having links to, again, quotes, terrorist organizations, all defined obviously by the US. And they were basically sent either to black sites or to, the Middle East, or they were sent to Cuba, where they set up Guantanamo Bay, basically.
What are black sites? Sorry.
So I'm going to go into that a little bit later. But the whole point, I guess, about these prisons, whether you're talking about black sites, whether you're talking about prisons in the Middle East or Guantanamo, is the fact that, again, you can bypass any normal judicial procedures. Right. So it's very similar to this administrative detention that we talked about before. That happens, that happens there. And the other thing I just wanted to mention before I talk about black sites is exclusively, who do you think this policy targeted? Muslim men. And, and they were essentially kidnapped. There are many brothers that have now been released from Guantanamo, alhamdulillah, and they are telling their stories about their experiences of the West's arm, right? The reach of the West, basically. And essentially, it was there to send out a message, right, to the global ummah. Look what we can do.
Yeah, and you said almost exclusively Muslim men, but also we know Afia Siddiqui is among them. This is a Muslim woman who has been held now for 2 decades. She was kidnapped from Karachi. She was tortured at Bagram prison. She is somebody who's been shot 3 times by American soldiers. She was then transferred to the US, to Texas, and is now being held in FMC Carswell, a federal medical prison that is actually known for sexual abuse and assault that takes place there. I was reading about this, and there's a report that 14 women reported sexual assault by staff members in just 1 year, from March 21 to March 22 at this prison. But the prison still passed standards that were set by the American government to eliminate rape in prisons. Her case really is every woman's worst nightmare. And, there is a big movement at the moment to get her released. And, our listeners can go onto the Afia Movement official Instagram page and, find out how they can get involved with the events and the different things that her legal team and her sister are trying to do at the moment.
Yes, subhanAllah. And, with Sister Afia Siddiqui as well, she was given up, basically, by, he's passed away now, Musharraf, the then
the Pakistani government.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So she was actually sold. She was sold to face this by herself. And I mean, the case is just is horrendous. But it goes back to this question again, linked to how did she end up in a detention facility in the US, a Pakistani citizen? Is what is the function of these nation states in the Muslim world? Pakistan being one of them, the Middle Eastern countries being others. They're effectively being used as colonial outposts, right? And they are part and parcel of the maintenance, again, of the West's colonial structure. And they are given a specific job to do, which is basically to serve US interests. That is what comes first. So, if part of that service is that you give up your own countrymen, Muslims, women even, then you do it as long as it serves those interests. If part of that is that you will accept secretly transferred detainees, right, to be interrogated on Jordanian soil or Moroccan soil or Egyptian soil by CIA, or interrogators that have come from the West, then that is the role that you'll play, right? And this is where black sites come in. Black sites are basically another word for secret prisons. And subhanAllah, they haven't just existed in the Muslim world. They've actually, it has been known that that the US have paid for these black sites in Poland, Lithuania, and Romania, which was quite a surprise. But basically, it's where the CIA operate a detention and interrogation program. And there was apparently this study that was done by the UN in 2010. And they found that since the year 2001, there had been this progressive and determined elaboration of a comprehensive and coordinated system of secret detention. And that involved basically the US and other governments. And they're saying that it pretty much covered all regions of the world, which is quite scary to be honest with you.
Oh my gosh, all those movies you watch of, they're just gonna, and they're usually American movies, right, where they just hood you, bag you, and you take you to some like offshore illegal prison. You don't know where you are, your family's never going to find you, and that kind of thing. It feels like a movie of, oh, this doesn't happen in real life. And it doesn't happen in real life to them, the ones in power, the ones, calling these shots, but it does happen in real life to people like us, or people we know, people who don't quite fit the bill, or people who come from those countries and those places where they're seeking to extract the natural resources or dominate over, those ones. I mean, we could have a whole other podcast on 9/11, but yeah, it's just completely different. It just made me, and especially when you talked about SubhanAllah, Sister Afia Siddiqui, and how Musharraf, and he'll be questioned about this on the Day of Judgment, gave her up, you were saying, to the Americans, and just these people in power who you're like, how can you do that to your own people, right? How can you oppress them? How can you put them in prisons? And we see, all over the current Muslim world, the Arab world, in Africa, in, the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, where prisons didn't necessarily exist pre-colonialism. Like, they weren't incarceration for long periods of time. That was not a punishment in and of itself. You'd be held there awaiting your sentence, right? That's how they used to be used. And then post the British, that was the prison sentence, and used very much, like you were saying, Farhana, earlier, to quell any political opposition, any uprisings to the structures of power. And that's what the colonialists, that's what the British did, because obviously they didn't want uprisings. And then before they left, they would often, and I was listening to a guy, a Kenyan who worked for another organization who kind of exposes British colonialism in different ways. He was saying that's what they did in Kenya as well, where the British would make deals and agreements with, say, chiefs of certain tribes to say, we will give you power, we'll give you money, we'll put you in positions of prominence if you do our dirty work, essentially. And then those people got land, and those people got, a stipend from the British sometimes, or agreements that their children would be given certain territories, XYZ. And then they would, obviously they want to keep that system going because it benefits them, right? To continue what the British had set up benefits them directly. So in Kenya, that was what was happening. He was saying, this Kenyan that I was listening to was saying, the prisons are not for the rich, right? The ruling class, the ones in power, they don't get tucked into the prisons like the common poor man, right? It's a different tier of punishment. It's a different kind of almost legal system that they use versus the everyday average man. And then that idea when he said, oh yeah, the chieftain tribes would be paid off and brought in, and they would run the prisons the way their British predecessors or masters, whatever you want to call them, how they would run them. It made me think, wow, you see that as well in the history of the Arab world, of how the British would get in there and do their dirty work and make their links and buy out people. So, in Jordan, you had the Hashemite family who, they supported, and Hussein bin Ali al-Hashimi, who they said, we will support you in the Great Arab Revolt against the Ottomans, right? And your son Faisal will be ruler of Iraq, and your son Abdullah will be ruler of Transjordan. We'll give you these big pieces. Eventually, he fell out with the British because after they'd made that deal, then the Sykes-Picot Agreement happened, and he refused to let them do what they wanted to do to Palestine. He was like, I'm not going to be part of this. So British got fed up with him and decided to go with the Ibn Saud family instead. And they're still in power. And you see how, in 1915, the Ibn Saud family had signed a treaty with the British. And until, 1924, he had a monthly subsidy of £5,000. And, you can see kind of the grubby fingers of the British still there in those countries till today. So, yeah, why would, King Abdullah of Jordan, who's a descendant, who originally put him in power there? It was the British. So when you sit there and you look at the map and you think, wow, yes, Jordan has accepted loads of Palestinian refugees, but why haven't they lifted a finger to stop the Zionists from completely eliminating the population of Palestine? Why isn't he, stopped a fighter jet or stopped a route here or put even one tank or one bullet on the ground to protect the Palestinians? Well, you're like, oh, actually, who's paying his salary? Who put him there in the first place? And this is not just, blind accusations we're throwing out here or conspiracy theorists. It's not. If you look into the history, the British were very clever, right? They might have left the territories. They don't call them a British mandate or protectorate anymore, but their influence is very much still there in the region. And when people are sitting there scratching their heads of why on earth aren't any of the Arab countries surrounding Palestine doing anything, it's like, well, those jets, those armies, those people, that payroll, it's not them. There are people at play behind the scenes who control those moves, who control where the army moves or doesn't move, whether this tank can be deployed or not deployed. You got to look at the history of these.
So, Zakia, I just want to stop you there before you go on any more about the agenda behind what we are seeing at the moment, and give us some more detail on that. Before you do that, I just wanted to make people aware of something about Guantanamo Bay and the black sites that our audience might not be aware of. There's actually some artwork which has come out, and this is the artwork of one of the prisoners, Abu Zubaydah, and he's actually Palestinian. He was captured in 2002, and for 4 years he was held in black sites that both you and Farhana have spoken about. And they were in Afghanistan, in Lithuania, in Morocco, in Poland, and in Thailand. So you can see how far this web it stretches. And since 2006, he's been in Guantanamo. And so he got out these 40 drawings to one of his lawyers. And, to say that his 40 drawings, a picture paints 1,000 words. No, it's more than that. His 40 drawings go into the details of the torture that he went through. He's been called like the forever prisoner because he's neither been charged with a crime nor does he have any prospect of release. And, it was claimed that he was a top Al-Qaeda operative, but, eventually the Americans have had to concede that he was not even a member of Al-Qaeda. And his lawyer, Professor Mark Denbo, he says everybody agrees that they tortured the wrong guy. They went ahead with it anyway so that they could get permission to torture other people. And his drawings, they are so accurate and they're so horrific. They just show too clearly exactly everything he went through. And to the extent that the faces of the CIA agents and the FBI agents that he has drawn in the pictures, they have to be covered to protect their identities. And I just wanted to say everybody needs to look up those pictures and have a look at them and read the report about American torture in the dark sites and in Guantanamo Bay.
I will say, though, a little bit of a trigger warning before you look those up, because they're quite, even though they're done, with a pen and pencil and it's not photographs, they're still quite horrific to think an actual human being was forced into these positions, into these conditions for the length of time, and just the physical but also mental torture that they would inflict on these prisoners in these black sites.
Yeah, absolutely. That those pictures need a trigger warning. They are horrific. They are absolutely horrific, but they are actually what somebody went through, and we owe it to them to look at those pictures. But yeah, be careful.
I think also it's just kind of another aspect of this whole prison system is obviously the torture. And you opened, Shagufta, by talking about Dr. Adnan, and we spoke briefly about Ahmed Manasara and kind of, the psychological torture he's been through, the solitary confinement. And I remember reading reports of just like the severe mental health that he suffered as a result of not having, of solitary confinement. You're not speaking to a single other living human being for how many days, months, years on end. And just this idea of it's not just physical war tactics and like new machine guns and new weapons and iron domes that they're designing as part of their military advancement. It's also prison and torture tactics that they're developing, and they're literally testing out on human guinea pigs, people like Abu Zubaydah, of, how else can we make them break? How else can we push them to the limit of human suffering without actually causing death? And the best way to test interrogation techniques is to try them out on actual human beings. And if you're so above the law, or if you've written the international law and you can veto anything in a Security Council or Human Rights Council or International Court of Justice, then who's going to hold you to account? If you can, you could literally get away with murder, which is what they've been doing. And just to expand a little bit about this idea of, war tactics and war advancement is remembering that there is a purpose, there is a greater purpose behind war. Why is it that the US in its history since 1776 has only been at peace for 17 years. They're fighting so many concurrent wars. Like, even if you just go on the Wikipedia page, right, and say how many wars are the US currently fighting, the number of foreign lands where they're doing some sort of military operation is ridiculous. Which is especially ridiculous for a country that claims to be a peace-loving, freedom-fighting, nation of all these ethics and goods and morals, because their own President Eisenhower said it back in the 60s of the importance of this military industrial complex. They figured it out after World War I and even before then, because come on, colonization's been around for a really long time. This idea of generating war, instigating division amongst people. I remember reading a book about African slavery and the slave trade. And this is going back kind of 16th century, even 15th century, of how you would often get the sort of 16th to 18th century, I would say, you would often get these Europeans who would come over and instigate one tribe against another tribe, say in the African subcontinent, and then supply weapons to both sides. So it doesn't matter who wins in the conflict, they're going to make their money, because there is no money in peace. Right. And you can see this in the way that America runs its foreign policy. They may claim to want peace, but why do you have military bases in 80 foreign countries? Why do you have CIA black sites across the world, torturing people offshore so that they're beyond the reach, the long arm of the law, if you want peace? Why do you need all of this? Why do you have such a huge military industrial complex? It's because there's money in war. War makes money, right? There is a lot of money in this military complex. And so again, I mean, we're doing a lot of zooming out today, but, make the link not only with colonialism, of the past, but modern day colonialism, modern day warmongering, and who the agents of war are. Who are the ones who claim peace? There's the ayah in the Quran of they claim to want peace, but really they are the troublemakers, right? And I know I've seen lots of people use it in reference to the Zionists particularly, but it's applicable also to, for example, the Americans, of all those warmongers in modern day history and past, and going back to the colonial past.
You mentioned agents, and I mean, it's one thing to talk about Americans or the British themselves and what they have done in their colonization, but at the same time, we can see that they've also done it through agents. And in recent days, we've seen with this renewed revolution movement taking place in Syria. And one of the sites that we see again and again is when the revolution is moving into new territory, we see that they have gone to the prisons and they are freeing prisoners. And these are Syrian men, women, children who are being released after years and years and years of being locked up by the agent Assad. And, the sheer joy on their faces in these videos that are coming out when they are released. And, he used prisons throughout his rule, and his father used the prison system. And, especially we saw after the Arab Spring, it was used to torture men, to torture women, to torture children. And there are whole, Instagram pages where all of this is documented. And, Assad's prisons, if it was possible for there to be more torture taking place anywhere else outside of, Guantanamo Bay or outside of Bagram prison or outside of even the Zionist prisons, then, that trophy goes to the Syrian prisons and what Assad did to the Syrian people. I came across a video just yesterday, and it's an old video, but it's an interview with he was a Syrian writer and renowned opposition activist, actually, who spent time in Syria's prison system. And his name was Mikel Kilo. He did an interview when he came out, and it was horrific what he described. He said he was a writer and, like a learned type of person. And he said when he was in prison, in one of these Syrian regime prisons, one of the guards took him to a particular cell and said to him, "Oh, you're a learned man. You're like an educated man. There's a child in this cell. Go and tell him a story." And he says in this interview, he says he went into the prison cell and he saw a woman and a child. And the woman, he said, just completely cowered away and curled up and, was completely afraid of him. And she was maybe like 27, 28 years old. And with her, she had like a child, a 4 or 5-year-old child. And he thought, oh. And he called up the child and he thought, yeah, let me tell him a story. And he said to the child, there was a bird. And the child said, "What's a bird?" And he was shocked because he didn't think he'd have to explain what a bird is. But then he thought, let me carry on. So he thought, okay, there was a bird that flew over a tree. And then he said, the boy said to him, what's a tree? And then he realized that I was just going to try and tell this boy a story about a bird and a tree and the sun and whatever. But this boy had never seen a bird. He had never seen a tree. So, I mean, this is how
heartbreaking.
It's awful. It's, I mean, this is a child. And, you know, he asked the guard afterwards, what's going on? Has this child never left this cell? And he said, yeah, this woman came in whilst she was pregnant.
Oh.
And she gave birth in the cell. And the child has never left the cell.
Oh.
So he's never seen a bird, never seen a tree.
And, you know, I think there is this apathy sometimes where, like, I remember, you know, you're talking about Syria in particular. You know, they used to say...
Yeah, this was in a Syrian prison. This was in a Syrian prison.
Yeah, they used to say, the people used to say in Syria, like I've heard some statements of, you know, it was all fine before, it was fine, great, wonderful, you know, all this, you know, there was a system. People lived. People in Syria, they used to say that the walls, this is like a phrase they used to use, that the walls can hear. Yeah. They used to be afraid of, like, even within your own family, there could be a spy. That you couldn't even talk with your own family freely about things. This is the level of, like, repression that we're talking about that existed in Syria. And so it's no surprise, really, like, when you're looking at the Arab Springs that then took place from that. I mean, it wasn't just Syria. Talking about, you know, Tunisia, Egypt, Syria. This was a, you know, a desperation and a fight against what has been happening to them generation after generation. And subhanAllah, what happened post-Arab Spring was that there was even more political repression. You know, it wasn't that the Arab Spring actually opened up things for the Muslims of that region, or, you know, for the people in general, but actually there was a broader strategy in how to prevent any type of Arab Spring-like event from taking place again. And so what you saw was even a stronger crackdown. I mean, I don't know what a stronger crackdown is, you know, after hearing just this one example, like, you know, what you were saying, Shagufta, that this child now who has done nothing wrong except for just to be, you know, the fact that he was in his mother's tummy.
So in mentioning Syria and the prison system in Syria and the treatment that the prisoners have faced, and I think we're going to see more of this in the coming days and weeks as these prisoners are freed, we can see that this has been a system that has been used by the regime under instruction from colonial powers to basically clamp down on any kind of movement or resistance that comes from the people, any kind of movement against the regime, any kind of protest or speaking up. I mean, Farhana, you said the people would feel that the walls have ears. You know, this is a system that's used to prevent the people from speaking out and to prevent the people from stepping out of line. Do not say anything against the regime. Do not say anything against your ruler. Do not even dream of disobeying. And in Syria especially, I think everybody would agree that the Syrian revolution was rooted in a movement for Islam, a movement that the people wanted to live under Islam. They didn't agree with the system in Syria that they were living under. It honestly was a and everybody, there's wide agreement about this, that the Syrian movement, out of all the Arab Springs, was a movement for a return to Islam. And, we need to ask ourselves, what does Islam say about everything that we've been talking about so far? This prison system, the treatment of prisoners, the torture taking place in these prisons. We've spoken about how it came to the land, how it came to this part of the world, how the colonizers brought it. And definitely, you've painted a picture for that, because it wasn't a part of the Muslim world before that, was it? We don't have stories in our seerah, in the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We don't have stories of prisons. We don't have stories of, long incarcerations and long prison sentences and torture in prisons, even in the stories of the Khulafa Rashidun, do we? So, or even in later years of Islamic governance. How does Islam look at these systems that we have been talking about?
You're right in the sense of the prisons that we see today. When you commonly think about prisons, this long incarceration prison sentence, the modern version of prisons has only been around for 250 years. Right. And in Islam, the punishments or the way that you deal with people committing crimes or committing injustice against another person, you've got three kind of main avenues. One, you punish them. And this will either be, Sharia legislated punishments or retaliatory punishments or discretionary punishments that are decided by the judge. Two, you can have financial compensation. And this is, assuming it's agreed by the parties, etc. So you can financially compensate depending on what the crime is. Or three, the victim can decide to forgive the perpetrator or the criminal, whoever's done the crime. And you'd have these structures or jails, if you want to call them, where the perpetrator of the crime would be held temporarily until the sentence is decided. So it wasn't this kind of, the holding in the jail wasn't the sentence itself. That wasn't how you punished somebody for the crime that they committed. It was a temporary holding place where you would either be punished or have some sort of financial compensation or forgiveness from the victims' families.
I was just going to say, so the forgiveness and the financial compensation obviously are in the situation where there is no hudud, there is no punishment from the Sharia that has to be meted out, correct?
Exactly. So this is assuming it doesn't go against any of the hudud, any of the laws written in the Sharia, which specify that, for example, let's just say, if somebody steals something, not for want or for hunger, but, just purely to take the possession of somebody else, then the hand of the thief will be cut. So in that situation where the Islamic legislation is very clear, that, assuming there aren't any other sort of circumstances around it, that this is the punishment allotted to this crime of stealing, then you don't have the option for the victim to just forgive or to financially compensate, because this is, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed it, this is what the legislation states. Right. So in cases where the punishment is not explicitly stated by the Islamic legislation, and it is possible, it is an option, according to the judge who is judging in the case, that, there is a possibility for financial compensation or for forgiveness, then those two options are allocated, assuming there isn't already a punishment that is set for that crime.
Okay, so that's clear. What about how does Islam look at prisons then? How do we as Muslims, if we're going to look at the prison system through an Islamic lens, how do we?
So I was reading this, it's a great question. And I was reading an article about sort of prisons, abolition and Islamic legal discourse, how, what's Islam's view on it, where the author was looking at modern day contemporary Islamic jurists, and some argued that it could be a form of discretionary punishment. So up to the decision of the judge. Some said that because there is no legal precedent in Islamic, like you were saying, Quran and Sunnah, Sirah, time of the Caliphs, etc., that this is actually unlawful, that you shouldn't have prisons in this form of, serving 20, 30-year prison sentences at all. And one scholar on the topic, a man by the name of Javed Ahmed Ghamidi, who was born in the 1950s, who was a Pakistani scholar, jurist, and influential public intellectual, he actually argued that prisons were not only not from the text, he actually argued it from a point of this idea of imprisoning someone was completely immoral and unjustifiable. And he discussed it on the front of 3 different fronts. So psychological harm, emotional harm, and collateral harm that will be done if you were to inflict this sort of punishment onto a person. So let's go through those one by one. So psychological harm. So when you think of, somebody who, say, is served a 20, 30, 40, even a 2-year prison sentence, even a 2-month prison sentence, where you're stuck in a cell, you forfeit control of your body, you can't get up, leave the place, go to the toilet, eat, drink, sleep, or even, go get some fresh air without the permission of somebody else. You are relieving that, that God-given rights that you have over your body to, relieve yourself when you need to stretch your legs, etc. Those have been taken away from you, right? And so the psychological harm of being in that cage, of being at the mercy completely of others, of forfeiting that control that you have, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you. He argues that by choosing imprisonment as a form of punishment, you will inflict emotional harm onto this person, right? So you're deprived of love, of affection, of, the warmth of hugging your child, of your wife, that normal human desire that's in our nature, that's in our fitra, as we call it in Islam, of, that human essence of wanting closeness, of wanting emotional connection with those that we love. And Ghamidi describes it as keeping people in a state of neither dying nor living. لا يموت فيها ولا يحيا, which, he borrows the words of the Quran, which are used to describe hell. You're not living or dead.
It reminds me again of Ahmed Manasar's case, when there was a particular time when his mother was in the court and he was also in the court, and at the end of the hearing she asked the judge if she could just hug her son, and the judge said no. And then she asked, can I just touch him then? And the judge said no. And then she said, can I just put my finger, one finger, through the bars so he can touch my finger? This is something that she needed, and she knew her son also needed this emotional connection.
Absolutely. And it kind of brings me nicely onto my next point of collateral harm, right? So he argues that not only are you inflicting emotional, psychological harm onto the person themselves who's been put into prison, you also cause a lot of collateral harm and punishment to those relations who did no wrong. Right. So that child, so the mother of Ahmed Manasara, she didn't commit any crime. That child of the woman who's imprisoned in that Syrian prison, what was his crime? Of all those, those Palestinian families whose fathers or brothers or menfolk have been kidnapped and imprisoned, who are now left without a provider, without their father, their brother, what was their crime? And the trauma that is inflicted upon them psychologically and throughout the rest of their lives, it's not just psychologically, it's also socially, having that, that the relative in jail, financially, of having one less breadwinner in the family to provide in such a dire situations anyway in Palestine. It's so difficult to earn a living because of all the constraints and restrictions the Zionists have imposed upon them. But also, we know that the trauma on the children of not being able to access their family member, their father or mother, whoever's imprisoned, and it will shape their personality. And Ghamidi asks, how can a society expect any child to develop a stable personality when you have imprisoned and treating like an animal, their beloved father or mother, whoever? And finally, he argues it almost on like a rational basis of, what is the goal of imprisonment, right? If the goal of imprisonment is to prevent, these people from reoffending, to prevent further crime, then those, any rational society would want rehabilitation for those prisoners, right? And we could do a whole podcast. I know we were talking about whether to, discuss this in this one or not, but about whether there is any sort of rehabilitation aspect of the incarceration prison system as we know it today, because we know that your personality, your actions are shaped by those around you, right? And we know that, the best way to have good actions is to keep good company. You've got hadith about it, but you've also got psychosocial studies on it, anthropological, sociological studies of, if you're in bad crowds, if you're amongst people who smoke, you're more likely to pick up the habit. If you're in even simple, mother's advice of make sure you make good friends. If you are stuck with for 24/7 of your 2-month, 2-year, 20-year prison sentence, the worst types of people who are then subjected to the worst types of psychological torture of being, all of their personal rights over their body have been relinquished, their rights to see their family and loved ones, those people who will keep them sane and good and remind them of, good things in life, has been taken away from them. And they're literally treated like animals. How can you expect anybody to come out of the prison system as a reformed, rehabilitated individual? So, just from, and this is Ghamidi was a jurist as well, right? As well as a scholar. And he's talking about all of these different things of how it's psychological harm, emotional harm, collateral harm on the families, and how actually the goal of preventing people from re-offending, to rehabilitate them as good members of society, that does not occur in a prison. So you're causing harm to the individual and you're making them worse, and you're also not achieving the goal of rehabilitating them.
It's such an interesting description you gave. I know it was like summarized, subhanallah. But as you were talking, I was thinking about the fact that this is how Ghamidi talked about people who actually committed potential crimes. And we are talking about, in our discussion, about what they have done, what these Western regimes have done to people who have not committed crimes, So look at the mercy, actually, for the one who has committed a crime, and how to help them and rehabilitate them, and how to actually not destroy them as people just because they've committed something that is considered to be a criminal offense. But what about the ones that haven't? SubhanAllah.
SubhanAllah, definitely so much for us to think about and reflect on. And unfortunately, we are coming to the end of today's podcast. But before we go, I'd just like each of you to make your final remarks, please.
I think the take-home message, or at least the biggest thing that I got out of this episode, was just how far colonialism goes, just how deep its roots lie. And I remember when I was listening to a webinar talking about kind of colonial prisons, abolitionists, etc., they were saying you've got to not only we're not just decolonizing our curriculum, right? But you've got to decolonize your minds as well, and think about the prisons, the power structures, the kind of intangible things the colonizers left behind. So these governments and these, the way they've organized things, the leaders, the rulers, the law that they've set down, these prisons that are supposed to be reforming these barbaric political uprisings, etc. You really got to question all of those things. What was the purpose of those things? Who put them in place and who were they serving, right? Is that truly something that we should take on board, when we're looking at Palestine and looking for solutions, or even, across the Muslim world, or even, across the world in general, when looking and thinking about justice and how can we do right by the human race? I remember I was listening to Ilan Pape talking about the Middle East and about how these nation state models are very, very new and were only built and designed and left there by the colonizers, right? That is not how the world worked. And it worked really, really well before the colonizers came and carved it up, right? You had a fluid model where Muslim, Christians, Jews, particularly in Palestine and Jerusalem, lived together in real peace and harmony. And we've got to go back to that system, that was there, that existed before the British came, that allowed all to prosper and flourish so well. What was it and what did it look like? And how can we return to a state that was like that instead of the oppressive one we're seeing today?
Okay, so take-home points are usually difficult. I'm going to summarize. I think that the one thing that I have realized from preparing for this discussion was the fact that the current system that we are living under, this colonial system, is not designed to provide justice. It's actually, I would say, designed to provide the opposite of justice. And when you compare this to Umar bin al-Khattab, who had sleepless nights over a potential, farm animal, or even a dog, like on a road somewhere that he is not even aware of, that the road might be a little bit rocky and that animal might, fall over and hurt himself. This is what he had sleepless nights over. And, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of men, women, and children that are languishing in prisons purely for the sake of actually demanding justice. In fact, purely for demanding justice, right? So I would say that the second point is that this current system can only be challenged by another system, another just system. And that can only be the Islamic political system. And I think that we also have to recognize that the war on terror that we spoke about, or the war on Islam even, is designed in a way to keep the Muslim Ummah divided and to make it feel that it's defeated. But I think that if we were to learn anything from the last, it's over a year now, is that if some of the most oppressed in the world are resisting and challenging the status quo, then we have a role to play in that too. Right. And fundamentally as well, that this is an obligation from Islam, and then we will be asked about this in our akhirah. Message to myself as well as anybody who, will take benefit from that, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. I just want to end by sharing a quote from Umar bin al-Khattab, radiallahu anhu, who said, "I would spend all the Ummah's wealth to release one unjustly imprisoned Muslim from the wrongdoers." And we pray and we work for a leadership like that once more, and a justice like that once more. So, Jazakallah khair for listening, and until next time, Assalamu alaikum.